Okay, good morning. Let's get started. Okay. So yesterday we were talking about virtual networks. We did discuss the importance of virtual network in the environment, right? So and we did also understood what is a CIDR block, and then how do we uh, calculate the number of IPs and the range of IPs that which we need for our requirement, isn't it? That's what our discussion yesterday. So what we discussed that a virtual network is a logical representation of your network on Azure. So you are going to go and segment your private network on Azure cloud into smaller parts, what we call it as virtual networks. Virtual networks will help you to isolate from one part of your network to the other, right? That's how you attain, better security and so on. So virtual network will allow you to talk to the other resources in Azure cloud itself, which means if one resource want to talk to the other resource on Azure, so they should be part of a VNet. When I say they want to talk over the private network, if they want to talk over the private network, they should be part of VNet. So a VNet can further be segmented into what do we call it as subnets. So a VNet should have at least one subnet in it. Otherwise you'll not be able to create a subnet or rather a VNet itself, right? So otherwise you'll not be able to create a VNet. So a subnet, it is nothing but you're further dividing your VNet into logical divisions. Then why do you need this division? For better management, better performance, and then security as well. We'll understand maybe today's or tomorrow's class how do we attain security at the subnet level. But for now, remember that the purpose of subnets is for better management, security, as well as what do we call it as performance improvement. So whenever you create a VNet, and then in that if you create a subnet, you will be losing how many IP address, guys? So each subnet you will lose 5 IP addresses, right? So this is very important. So at each subnet you lose 5 IP addresses. These 5 IP addresses are reserved and used by Azure for its own purpose, right? So the first IP address, which is .0, .1, so .2, .3, and .255 are the IP addresses that which will be reserved whenever you create a subnet. So as we know, the first IP address, we call it as network IP or network ID, which will be used to identify the network itself. .1 for gateway, .2 and 3 for DNS mapping of Azure, and then .255 for broadcast. Right? This is what we were discussing yesterday. And then we did see, excuse me, how do we create a virtual network, and how do we use those virtual networks. That's what we were seeing yesterday, right? So today we are going to discuss about the public and private IP addresses in detail. Then how do we set static public and static private IP addresses for our infrastructure, right? And then what are the different types of public IP addresses we got, right? And what is the difference between them? So that is something that which we should be aware of. So to start with, so what do we do is we go ahead and deploy a virtual network with one subnet in it. So for this demonstration, right, so let us go ahead and create right. So I'm going to go and create a VNet. So let us call this VNet as VNet1. I'm creating only one VNet. And in this VNet, we'll create two subnets, subnet1 and subnet2. Right, let us create another one, which is subnet. Right, so every virtual network will have an address space. We know that. So let us pick the address space as 10.0.0.0/22, which means you get how many IP addresses? 1024 IP addresses. I am segmenting this VNet IP addresses into subnets. So the subnet one also require an IP address range. We know that yesterday we were discussing. So subnet one, let us take this as 10.0.0.0/24. Subnet 2, let us take it as 10.0.1.0/24. Right? So let us go and deploy this, what do we call it as network infrastructure, and then we will get into understanding of private and public IP addresses. Right, guys? So let us deploy this entire stuff in central US, that is the location, and I will deploy this in MSDN subscription, the subscription whatever I have, the name of the subscription. Right? So how do I do that? Go to your portal, right? Go to your Azure portal, look for a service called as virtual networks, right? Look for a service called as virtual networks, create virtual network, right? So put it in the subscription called as MSDN. It requires a resource group. I'll put it in a resource group called as Vijay RG. Let us name it as VNet1 as per our diagram. And we need to put that in central US, that is there in central US by default. So then if you go to the IP addressing, so this is what you need to change. We were supposed to use 10.0.0.0/22 as per our diagram. You see this diagram, right? It is /22. So that is the VNet IP address. And how many subnets you need? I need 2 subnets. The first subnet is subnet 1 and its IP address 10.0.0.0/24, which means 256 IP addresses you get. 24, I'm sorry. Yeah, 256 IP addresses you get. But out of the 256 IP addresses, 5 IP addresses are reserved. So the available IP addresses are 251, right? So that is my subnet 1. Similarly, I go and create my second subnet. I call it as subnet 2, right? And I'll pick the next available range, that is 10.0.1.0/24. That is the IP address of my second subnet. I go ahead and create my virtual network. Right, guys? Go and create my virtual network. So now we have this, what do we call it as required network components in place. But when you deploy your resources, right, that requires private IP addresses, right? As I was explaining yesterday, the resources will sit under what? Under subnets, right? Let us say there is a virtual machine. Maybe you want to deploy it. So you either deploy in subnet 1 or subnet 2, right? So this virtual machine will automatically receive private IP addresses from what? From the subnet. So the subnet will automatically assign public IP addresses, private IP addresses to your resources. So let us say there is this VM called as VM1, maybe a Windows virtual machine which you deployed in subnet 1. A server you deployed, which we call it as virtual machine. And this server will get an IP address assigned, private IP address assigned. So then remember, it is not the server that gets the IP address assigned. Remember this. So it's not the server that gets the private IP address assigned, but it is a network interface card of the VM that gets private IP address assigned. So the IP addresses are not directly assigned to your virtual machines, rather the IP addresses are assigned to the network interface card of the virtual machines. You're getting this? So whether it is public or private IP addresses, the IP addresses are assigned to what? IP addresses are assigned to, right? Assigned to what? Assigned to your network interface card of the VM, right? Something that which we should be aware of. Okay, so let us do this. Let us go and try to deploy one virtual machine and see how things will be. Okay. Right. So in order to do that, I'll go back to my portal. You see your VNet is created, and this is your VNet, and you got 2 subnets in it, right? And since we didn't deploy any resources, the number of IPs available are 251. 5 IPs are used by Azure, right? So though it is 24, you get only 251 IPs. Right. So to demonstrate the usage of these IP addresses and so on, let us deploy one virtual machine, which is nothing but a server. Okay. So I'm deploying a virtual machine by going to this service called as virtual machines. And then I hit this create virtual machine, right? Create virtual machine. Then I deploy this particular virtual machine in MSDN subscription because my network is in MSDN subscription. I deploy this in a resource group. You can pick any resource group. I'll deploy this in Vijay RG resource group. The name of the virtual machine as per our diagram, as per our MS Paint picture, it is VM1. And it should be sitting where? It should be sitting in central US itself because my network infrastructure is in central US, right? Now select it. And then what operating system I want to deploy? I want to deploy a Windows 2019 Data Center Edition. Let the size be so. I'll go ahead and use the username and password local admin credentials. This is local admin credentials using which you log into the system. Okay, without which you will not be able to log in. So I'm using cloud admin as username and I'll set some password for it. Right? So then where do I put this virtual machine in VNet 1 and Subnet 1? I need to tell Azure that boss, this VM should be in VNet 1 and Subnet 1, isn't it? So that's where whenever you deploy the virtual machine, you need to completely fill the basics blade and then you need to go to the networking section of it. Under the networking section, you will be asked, boss, tell me in which VNet and subnet this virtual machine should be sitting. So we know that this virtual machine should be sitting in VNet 1. In this VNet 1, it should be sitting in subnet 1. Now, if you got multiple virtual networks in central US location, because you are deploying this virtual machine in central US, if it has got multiple virtual networks there, all those virtual networks will be displayed here. Since we got only one virtual network, that's why that is the one that which is displayed, and it displays the number of subnets that VNet has got. That VNet has got 2 subnets, and we need to place it in subnet 1 as per this particular scenario. Right, guys? Now, there is also a setting here, if you look at closely, public IP address. So does this virtual machine require a public IP address? That is the question that which is asked there. If the application you are hosting on this virtual machine is accessed from the internet, if you are hosting an application that needs to be accessed over the internet, then the virtual machine will get a public IP address assigned. You getting? So it all depends on your requirement, but in the real-time world, not every machine will have a public IP address. Only when there is a requirement, only when the application that whichever you are hosting on this, if it's an internet facing, then you assign the public IP address. Otherwise, we generally don't assign public IP addresses unless it is required. So when you assign a public IP address, you are exposing that particular application or server to the internet, isn't it? So a lot of problems there. So make sure that you understand your requirement, whether you need a public IP address or not. Based on that, if you don't need, you can select none. If you need a public IP address, then you say that I need a public IP address. It creates a new public IP address for you. Right, guys? Now, so we'll get into the public IP address discussion in some time, but this is what you need to know now. So for me, since I have to access this virtual machine from my system, I definitely need a public IP address to this. So I go ahead and review and create a public IP address. Right? Create a public IP address. Sorry, to create a public IP address along with the virtual machine. So this creates a virtual machine, and that virtual machine will be placed where? It will be placed in VNet 1, subnet 1, guys. Right? So let us wait for that to get deployed. Right? So like this, whenever you deploy your resources, you will select the VNets and subnets, which defines in which VNet and subnet that particular resource should be sitting. That's how you configure things. Now, all right. So let that get deployed. In the meantime, we'll do some discussion on IP addressing. Right. So when you deploy a resource on Azure, it can be a virtual machine or maybe a load balancer or anything. So these resources requires IP addresses because you access your virtual machines through IPs. Your virtual machine will talk to another virtual machine through IP addresses. If you are hosting an application that needs to be accessed through a load balancer, that also requires an IP address. So your Azure resources requires IP addresses. Now, what addresses do they need? They either be having private IP addresses. They will also sometimes have public IP addresses as well. So, for example, if you are deploying a virtual machine, the virtual machine should definitely have a private IP address. It will definitely have it. Right? Without private IP addresses, virtual machines cannot be deployed. Without putting the virtual machine in a VNet and subnet, you cannot deploy. So obviously, a virtual machine requires a private IP address. Now, if the virtual machine I was explaining a minute back, if it is an internet-facing application is hosted on this, then this will also require a public IP address. So your Azure resources may have a requirement of private as well as private public IP addresses, or only private IP addresses if it is not exposed to the internet. Right? Now, so when we talk about private IP addresses, how your resources are getting private IP address assigned? The private IP addresses are assigned by subnets. Subnet assigns the private IP address. That's how your resource will get the private IP address. Then how your resource will get public IP address? The resource will get public IP address. You create a public IP address. You as an admin create a public IP address and assign it to the network interface card of the VM. That's how the VM will get a public IP address. So for public IP address, you need to create it and associate it to the network interface card. Right? Now, the resources which are internet facing, the resources that are accessed over the internet will get public IP addresses. The resources that will communicate within the virtual network or within the Azure cloud or on premises through VPN, they require a private IP address. Right? Internal communication purpose, you need private. That might be within the cloud or even to the on premises as well. Right, guys? Now, so let us go back to our resource. This is a virtual machine which we deployed, isn't it? This is a virtual machine. Now, this virtual machine, whatever you deployed, has got a private IP address assigned, which is 10.0.0.4. Right? Now, why is this .4? Why not .0, 1, 2, 3? Because they are reserved. So the first IP address assigned is .4. And this virtual machine has also got a public IP address assigned to this, because we said that we need a public IP address. So a public IP address is assigned. So if you go to the virtual machine and go to the networking section under the settings, so you will see that, right? So this VM is sitting in a VNet 1 and subnet 1, right? And this is the network interface card of this VM. Remember, network interface card by itself is a separate resource. So network interface card of the VM is a separate resource, and this network interface card is attached to this virtual machine. That's how it will work. So if you go and look at this VM1235, which is the name of the network interface card, if you go to this, right? So this network interface card has got what IP address? Private IP address. So it's always the network interface card of the VM that gets the private IP address. And this network interface card is also attached with a public IP address, which means the network interface card gets the public IP address. But remember, public IP address by itself is a separate resource. So VM1-IP is a public IP address resource, and this resource has got this IP address, and it is attached to what? To the network interface card of the VM. That's how things will work, right? So either it is a public or private, the network interface card of the VM will get the IP address. That's why when you go to your virtual network, if you go to your virtual network, VNet1, and go to these connected devices, you don't see VM name here. The device name is not VM here. What is that you're seeing? The network interface card. Because it is a network interface card that gets the IP address, so your network interface card is listed, not VM. And of course, this network interface card is in turn associated or attached or tagged to your virtual machine. Right? Like that. Okay. Now, so let us get into a discussion on public IP address. So as I said, public IP address is a separate service on Azure. You see this? The service called as public IP address. And you can create public IP addresses by using the create option, or during the deployment of your virtual machine. The virtual machine itself creates a public IP address. In case you tell virtual machine wizard that I need a public IP address. So that's why this VM1 public IP address is created, right? So let us see how does this public IP address creation works, right? So go and hit the create option, right? This is how the public IP address creation or resource creation looks like. So it is asking you a few questions. Vijay, tell me what IP address you want. Public IP address again can be configured as a 32-bit IPv4, or it can be configured as an IPv6, or you can also have both. So which means you are creating a resource called as public IP address. So this resource will be assigned with the public IP addresses. So based on what you select here, maybe IPv4 or IPv6, or maybe both of them. So your public IP address comes with two SKUs. Your public IP address comes with two SKUs. What is SKU? SKU stands for stock keeping unit. Stock keeping unit. You can also call this as model or edition or tier, whatever you call it as. It represents the model, or it comes with two SKUs or two tiers, you can say. Standard and basic. So what are the two SKUs? Basic and standard. Isn't it? Basic and standard. So now the question is, when should I use a basic public IP address? When should I use a standard public IP address? Whenever I am deploying my public IP address resource. Now remember, standard is what is recommended for production environment. Standard is recommended for production environment. Why? Why? Because it is secure by default. It is secure by default. Tomorrow's class will understand how the public IP address of type standard is secure. It is secure by default. And it provides you high availability, or redundancy or high availability is guaranteed here. Redundancy or high availability is guaranteed here. When you go with standard. By default, standard public IP address is static. Static, that is the default. And you cannot change it. The standard public IP address is static, that's all. Right? Which means the IP address will not change. It will be same as is. If today it is assigned, the resource is assigned, the public IP address resource is assigned with a.b.c.d as a public IP address, the IP address will be intact as long as that resource is there. That's what a dynamic is. So that's what a static is, right? So always go with standard. The reason is it is secure, it is redundant, right? And it is highly available. and by default the IP address. For the resource public IP address, whatever the public IP address assigned, it is static by default. So when we talk about basic, it is exactly opposite to the standard, right? It is not secure, isn't it? It is not secure, right? And it doesn't provide redundancy, no high availability. And by default, it is dynamic. By default, it is dynamic. Of course, you can change this to static as well if you want. You can change this to static. But here, it is static itself. You cannot change it to dynamic or whatsoever, right? So, but when you go with basic, by default, it is dynamic public IP address. You as an administrator can manually set that to static, isn't it? Can manually set that to static, right? Now, so let us see how does that actually the configuration looks like. So we are here in the portal, right? We are here in the portal. So I'll go and search for a service called as public IP address or public IP addresses. Create a public IP address. Then it is asking you, Vijay, whether you need IPv4 or IPv6 or both. I need IPv4. Then it is asking you standard or basic, right? If you go with basic, now what do you see, right? It by default it picks dynamic. Of course, you can set that to static. And there is no redundancy solution here. If you look at this, there is no zones or there is no zones option which will provide you redundancy. But when you change this IP address queue to standard, now you see this IP address assignment is static by default. The dynamic one is grayed out. You cannot change it. And then what you see here is you see the availability zone, which will provide you redundancy for your public IP address. But when you go with basic, you don't see that availability zone, right? So that's why when you are creating a public IP address for your production workloads, always go with what? Standard. It may cost little more when compared to basic, but always go with standard. Okay. So for this demonstration, let us first create a basic public IP address, right? I'm creating a public IP address called as basic. I'll name it as test public IP address. Now remember, this is a public IP address resource which you are creating. And this resource will be assigned with the public IP address. You get it? So you're creating a resource called as test public IP address. You getting, guys? So you're creating this resource called as test public IP address. And this test public IP address will be assigned with an IP address, and that public IP address will be associated to a VM or whatsoever. That's how it actually works, if you want, right? Okay. Right. So let us go back, right? Public IP address, let it be static. And if you want to assign a DNS name to the public IP address, you can do it from here itself, right? You can assign a DNS name to this. For example, if I am giving the name here, test IP, test PIP, public IP address, let us call it as test public IP address. Then the DNS name would be testpip.centralus.cloudapp.azure.com, right? That's how your public IP address.
Vijay, your voice is little bit noise, Vijay.
How about others? Naveen?
Now also.
Fine. It's fine, Vijay.
So seems some issue from your side.
It's fine here also.
So there you need to check from your side. Thank you. Right. So what I'm saying is the DNS label here is a DNS name given to your DNS name given to your, what do we call it as, public IP address, right? So the DNS name given to your public IP address, right? And then you can go with subscription, right? You can go with subscription for billing purpose, the resource group where the resource should be created, right? And then the location where it should be, right? So remember that the the public IP address should be in the same region where your resources are. Which means if I'm deploying a virtual machine in central US, which means if I'm deploying a virtual machine in central US, my public IP address should be in the same region, right? So maybe if you're deploying a load balancer that requires a public IP address, the public IP address should be in the same region where your load balancer is. Okay, right. So I'm going to go and create this public IP address. And what type of public IP address we are creating, guys? We are creating basic. Okay, we'll see how do we change this to standard in a while. Okay, right. So I'm going to go and create a public IP address, right? So like this, you manually create the public IP address and use whenever you are deploying your resources, or during the deployment of resources like virtual machines or load balancer, an option will be given to you there itself to create a public IP address. It's up to you how do you want to do it, right? Now, so we just created one public IP address, which as I said is a resource, so which should be available here. Still creating it, you see deployment in progress. Right, your public IP address resource is created, right? And you see, right, test public IP address, right? If you go to this, right, guys, now it is basics queue, and this is the IP address assigned. Who assigned it? Azure automatically assigns a public IP address. So this resource has got this public IP address. So whenever you assign this resource to any of the resource, this public IP address is assigned. As simple as that. Okay. Now, so can we upgrade this basic public IP address to standard? Answer is yes. Okay. Now, a couple of very important things. If the public IP address is used by, let us say, a VM or load balancer, then you need to disassociate it. If the public IP address is associated with some resource, before you upgrade, you need to disassociate it. For example, the other public IP address, this is VM1 IP, right? You can upgrade, this is also basic, you see, you can upgrade it to standard. But before you upgrade it, right, you can see this, when I hit that upgrade it, your public IP address is currently associated, right, currently associated to something. And what it also says is the allocation method is dynamic. So for you to upgrade a public IP address from basic to standard, maybe your business says that, okay, well, let us go with standard. First, you need to disassociate with the resource, whichever is using that. Second, if it is set to dynamic, you should change that to static. Okay, so before you go with an upgrade, disassociate this public IP address with the resource, whatever is using it. And then second step, go ahead and change the assignment from dynamic to static. Then you can upgrade it. Okay, so let us do that. So I'm changing this public IP address from dynamic to static, and I will save this, which means this basic public IP address now is a static public IP address. That is step 1. And step 2 is what, guys? I need to disassociate this VM, this network interface card is using this public IP address. I'll hit this disassociate, which means the network interface card is no longer associated with the public IP address, which means the VM itself will not have the public IP address, isn't it? I'll show you that. Okay. Right. So it is disassociating with the network interface card. Okay, so now you see this is disassociated, right? This is disassociated, right? Now, if you go back to your virtual machine, right? This virtual machine earlier it had a public IP address, you remember, right? It doesn't have public IP address anymore. Why? Because the network interface card associated with this virtual machine, the network interface card associated with this virtual machine doesn't have a public IP address assigned, right? Doesn't have public IP address assigned, right? So that's how your things will work. Now let us go back to the public IP address. And now I can upgrade this basic public IP address to standard, isn't it? So go and hit this upgrade to standard SKU. And then very important, you will not be able to revert it once you upgrade it to standard. It is one way, means basic to what do we call it as standard, you upgrade it, but you cannot revert it, isn't it? You cannot revert, right? So I understand that. So that's what it is warning you. Once you upgrade it, you cannot revert. So I go ahead and upgrade. So like this, you can upgrade a basic public IP address to a standard public IP address, which is irreversible. Now, two important things before you upgrade: make sure that the public IP address resource is static, and make sure that if the public IP address is associated with some resource, you need to disassociate before you upgrade, right? Things to be aware of. So now this is upgrading from basic to standard. Once it is upgraded, I'll go and associate this back to the network interface card, which means my VM will again get the IP address, right? Okay, so now you see, if you refresh this, right? If you refresh this, now the IP address is changed to standard. So if I want to associate back, hit associate. Associate to what? Associate to network interface card. Select the name of the network interface card. Say OK. Now that network interface card, whichever was holding this public IP address before you upgraded, is assigned back with the same public IP address, right? Like that. Okay. Right. So your VM will now get that IP address back, right? That's how things will work. So what are those?
Vijay, one question here.
Yeah, go ahead, man.
So when we are doing this in a production, so if let's say whatever the server that we are changing the this option from basic to standard, there'll be a production impact, right? So when we are removing the public IP, and if any application is internet facing,
Yes.
what would be the scenario that will be taken out in the situation?
See, if you definitely there will be an outage. If you want to minimize, see what will generally you do is you will not give public IP addresses to your users. Okay, so most of the scenarios, what you generally do is you will have a DNS name, right? You have a DNS name. That is what your users will use, and this DNS name will be having your public IP address. It's like a contact that which you feed on your mobile number, right? So name associated with the public IP address. So if you are changing this, right, what I would suggest, if you want to reduce the impact, associate, let it be the same, create a new public IP address, and then create with the right configuration and associate with this, right? So it makes maybe a couple of minutes for these changes to get replicated across the internet. But if your requirement is not to have the same public IP address, it will work even if you have a different public IP address. You can create a different public IP address resource and map it to this DNS name, rather disassociating it and then waiting for 3-4 minutes for disassociation and then updates and so on. Create a new public IP address resource, tag it to this DNS name, which may take maybe 1 or 2 minutes for internet replication versus maybe around 10 minutes in this scenario, right? If you don't want, if you want to use the same public IP address, then you definitely have to go with the outage, right? You need to get into, the discussion with business, take outage, and then go with the change, right? That's all. Okay. Hope that clarifies your question.
Yeah, thanks.
Right. So what are those resources that use public IP addresses, right? Virtual machines require public IP addresses. Apart from virtual machines, what are those resources that require public IP addresses? So virtual machine uses public IP address, but it is not virtual machine. What on virtual machine will use public IP address? Network interface card. And your Azure load balancer, this is the load balancing solution. Let us say you are hosting some web servers, a pool of web servers, web server 1, web server 2, web server 3. And these web servers to be accessed over the internet. And you have a load balancer as a front end for this. The load balancer, since it has to be accessed over the internet, it requires a public IP address. So your Azure load balancer front end configuration will have a public IP address provided the application is internet based, right? Now there is another load balancing solution called as application gateway. Azure load balancer is one type of load balancing solution. Azure also provides you another load balancing solution called as application gateway. Application gateway will also work like your Azure load balancer, but it is only for web applications. Okay. Now, in case if the web application to be accessed over the internet, the application gateway is the front end for it. The front end configuration of that web application does also require a public IP address, another scenario. So virtual machines, Azure load balancer, which is a load balancing solution, application gateway, another load balancing solution. In case if these are internet facing, they require what? Public IP addresses. Now, in case if you're using a VPN solution, VPN gateway. Now, what is this VPN gateway? Let us say there is on-premises environment, your data center, maybe let us say in Houston. You got some data centers and you got some applications running here. And your organization also adopted Azure Cloud, right? Azure Cloud. And here also you host some applications. And you have a requirement to interconnect the Azure Cloud network with on-premises, which means maybe some application here want to talk to some application here, right? So then how does this environment is set up? How can we configure this? This we call it as hybrid environment. We call it as hybrid environment. So when you have a requirement of hybrid environment, the network layer should be interconnected, isn't it? So which means you deploy a VPN solution here. You deploy something called as VPN gateway. And you also deploy a VPN device here on premises. There will be a VPN device on premises and there will be a VPN gateway on Azure Cloud. Now these two devices should talk to each other to establish connection between two networks. And remember, this entire traffic, whatever will flow, is an encrypted traffic. That is the purpose of this VPN, isn't it? Virtual Private Network. VPN stands for Virtual Private Network. So for this device to connect to a device on premises, this should have what IP address? It should have public IP address. So your VPN gateway to talk to your on-premises VPN device requires what IP address? Public IP address. So that's why your VPN gateway also requires a public IP address. So your virtual machines, load balancers, and application gateways and VPN gateways are required with public IP addresses. Otherwise, you will not be able to configure in case if they are internet facing. Right? Very important. Now, let us get into private IP address. Before I go with private IP addresses, any questions related to this, please ask.
Hi Vijay, this is Shrikant.
Yes, Shrikant.
My question is like we created a VM and we assigned a private IP and subnet and a public IP, right? So if we just in case if we deleted this VM, all this we assigned the private IP and subnet, all this will get deleted, or still we can use these IP addresses if we create a new VM?
Okay, it depends on how you are deleting it, right? So if you go to the virtual machines and if you say go and delete this, right? So it'll ask you an option here, right? So when you say delete VM, it is asking you, do you also want to delete network interface card? Do you also want to delete public IP address? If you select those options, then they will be deleted. Otherwise, by default, they will be retained, right? So if you go ahead and use this delete option within the VM, it is giving you an option to select whether you want to delete them or not along with the VM. By default, they will not be. If you want to delete them, select it and delete it. By default, the public IP and network interface card will not be deleted along with the virtual machine. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, right. So where were we? Right. So we were talking about the public IP addresses, and that's the end of the public IP discussion. Now let us get
Vijay, one more question. I have one more question for public.
go ahead.
Hello. So when we are creating any Azure resource, let's say that be VM or any other thing. So when you have created a virtual machine, I saw there is an option when public IP saying create a new IP. So is there an option while creating an Azure resource itself where we don't want to have a public IP address? Is there an option while creating an Azure resource itself?
Yeah, you can define here. No, one is see here you got. I am showing virtual machines because it's easy to understand. Here you got public IP. You can create, or you can set this to none, which means no
Okay.
public IP address will be assigned. Okay.
Okay.
You have to set it to none so that there will not be any public IP assigned to this. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Right. Private IPs. Now, private IPs are used for internal communication, right? Internal communication. For example, there's a VNet, and in this VNet you have some multiple subnets, and those subnets has got some virtual machines, right? Like this. And these virtual machines should talk to each other. Or maybe there is another VNet, VNet 2, let us say VNet 1, VNet 2. Maybe there are also some virtual machines here. And this virtual machine here want to talk to a virtual machine here. And how do? It? They use private IPs. So internal connectivity, communication between the resources within the Azure will happen for private IPs, right? And private IPs, who assigns them? Your subnet assigns them automatically. They are assigned automatically by the subnet, right? So the moment you place your resource in a subnet, subnet dynamically allocates the IP address, dynamic allocation, right? So let us try to understand this, right? So we did deploy one virtual machine, right? So let us log into that. Yes, I'm going to this virtual machine. I'll try to connect to this virtual machine using RDP, and I'm connecting using the public IP address on 3389 port, which is nothing but RDP port. So I downloaded the RDP file. I do hit this VM1, right? Say connect, right? So enter the credentials, the local admin credentials, whatever you set during the deployment. I did set that cloud admin is the username, and its password, whatever you set during the creation of the VM, right? And try to log. Right. So let us see the IP configuration part on this machine. Okay. So private IP. Right. Let us go to the command prompt by just going to the run and type cmd and run this command called as ipconfig/all, which will give you IP address details of that machine. So when you look at this, the IP address is 10.0.0.4. And if you look at closely, it is dynamically assigned IP address. DHCP enabled means dynamically assigned IP address. So which means this subnet, whenever you create a subnet within the VNet, that subnet is assigning the IP address to this virtual machine or network interface card of this virtual machine. Okay? So then how do I set this particular IP address as static? So in the real-time world, we don't assign any dynamic IP addresses to any machine, isn't it? Because there is a possibility of that IP address getting changed. When it is dynamic, there's a possibility of that IP address getting changed. And we don't want to get into that situation, right? So then what do you do? How do I set this as a static IP address? If you do it on premises, you go to the network interface card, isn't it? On premises, what you do, you go to the network interface card, and then you go to the Ethernet, and then right click it, right? Adapter options, yeah. So you need to go to the network interface card, right click properties, go to IPv4, right? Properties, and then you assign that as a static IP address here. That's what you do on premises. But on Azure, you don't do this way. No, you should not be doing this. So on Azure, the static IP address should be set at the network interface card on portal. So we generally don't set static IP address on the operating system layer. Rather, you set static IP address by going to the network interface card of the virtual machine. So in order to know what is the network interface card of this VM, I need to go to the networking of that virtual machine. Then here it is listed the network interface card used by this virtual machine. Go to the network interface card. And if you go to this option called as IP configurations under settings, there is this IP configurations under settings. So here there is this configuration called as IP config 1, which is telling that this is the private IP address of your network interface card, and it is set to what? It is set to dynamic. So now you need to change here this from dynamic to static, not at the operating system layer. So if I hit this IP config 1, then what do you see here? Private IP settings. And your network interface card is in this VNet and subnet. And the IP address assignment is dynamic. Now you change this to static. You want to use the same IP address, use it. Maybe you want to assign a different IP as a static IP address. You can do it, but make sure that that IP address is not used by any other resource. Okay. Okay. So set it to static by saving. Right. Again, I'm repeating, don't do this at OS layer on Azure. Okay. Now, so it takes a while for that to get saved. And this IP address will not change for that VM, for that NIC. Right? That's how you can set static IP address to your network interface cards. Right? And in the same network interface card, under the same IP configuration, you also see public IP address, because your public IP address is assigned to what? Assigned to a NIC. You want to disassociate, you can associate from here. You want to change the public IP address, you can change it from here. right? All those things can be done. Or you want to create a new and assign it, you can do it from here, right? So that's how private IP addresses should be set as static. Now, what resources will use private IP addresses? The network interface card of the VM require a public private IP address. Now, if your Azure load balancer is internal, maybe you're hosting an intranet web application or some application used within the corporate network, then what IP address does the load balancer require? Does it require a public IP address? No, obviously not. It requires private. So if it is an internal load balancer, not internet facing, the front-end configuration requires a private IP address. If it is an application gateway, again, this is another load balancing solution. If the application gateway is hosting an application which is accessed within your corporate network, the front-end configuration requires a private IPs. Right? So by default, the private IPs are assigned by the subnet or dynamic. You can set to the static by going to the network interface of the resource. Right, guys? This is about static IP addressing and private IP addresses. Any questions related to this? Please ask. Is this concept clear? Right. So if that is clear, the next topic we have to discuss is network security groups. This will help you to configure some rules which will define which traffic is allowed into the network, which traffic is denied to enter the network, both for incoming and outgoing. Right. So that is your next topic, which is network security group. We'll be completing this in tomorrow's class. Okay. So NSG will complete tomorrow. After NSG, we'll learn about Azure firewall. And then there is a DNS service also within Azure, which is not widely used. We'll also try to learn because it is needed for at least the exam preparation. Okay. So once we complete these topics, then we'll go with the hybrid network solutions. How do we interconnect networks in different regions of Azure? How does we interconnect different virtual networks, maybe in the same region or different region? How do we interconnect on-premises network with Azure cloud? And there are multiple VPN solutions which we'll discuss. Practically, we'll see that, and then we'll go with express route. Express route, we'll be talking only the theory part because we'll not be able to demonstrate it, right? And then after this, we'll talk about routing. How do we create our own static routes if there is a requirement? Then load balancing solutions. So that will conclude our discussion on the network. So tentatively, by the end of this week, we should be at least completing the DNS part at least there, and next week we'll be completing the entire network. Okay. So as I said, don't miss any of the classes. Even if you miss the class, try to listen the video on the same day so that you have an understanding whatever is needed for the next class. Okay, that is very. So all the videos are already uploaded mostly on the same day. Request you to go through them. Just you can play on your mobile also when you're traveling to spend some time. Okay. Maybe an hour video should be enough to. On mobile also you can play and listen. Right? Okay. So with that, today's discussion will conclude. In case if you got questions, you can take it. You can take that. Okay, so if no questions, we'll meet tomorrow at the same time. I wish you guys have a great day ahead. Thank you. Bye.